Okay, I'm really going to tell you the story of our encounters with risk assessment as it's done in the EU. First of all, I just wanted to make a very brief comment on Angelica's very interesting presentation. I think that EFSA have actually tried to define biological relevance at last because they were being attacked for using this phrase and allowing it to be used by industry, and it wasn't defined. They actually brought out a guidance defining biological relevance, but it's hilarious. If it wasn't so tragic, it would be very funny. It basically allows industry to decide what is biological relevance, so they can define it on a case-by-case basis, so they can even vary the definition as it suits them. Okay, so independence of science in risk assessment. Our journey with this started in 2010, actually with the publication of Professor Carrasco's study on glyphosate and Roundup, which he is sick of hearing about by now, but it did have quite an effect in the EU. His study showed that the herbicide Roundup and its active ingredient glyphosate causes malformations in frog and chicken embryos at doses much lower than those used in agriculture. The researchers said that the study was relevant to human risk assessment because the mechanisms of development are the same in humans as in frogs and chickens, and also because the malformations observed in the experiments were the same as those found in human populations exposed to Roundup spraying on genetically modified Roundup-ready soy in South America. Also, the study managed to identify a mechanism, which is quite unusual in these studies, and it sorted out that the mechanism was the retinoic acid pathway, which is common to most animals, including humans. So this drives a kind of a stake through the heart of Monsanto's and industry's general claim that Roundup herbicide is only specific to plants and it doesn't affect mammals and all the animals that we want to protect. Now, we were concerned about this because Roundup is used everywhere. It's not only used on farms, but farmers do use it, obviously. They use it on Roundup-ready crops, and also increasingly they use it to burn down or desiccate the crops before harvest. So that can result in quite high residues in the remaining crop. It's also used in public spaces in Europe, roadsides, pavements, railway lines, in parks, school grounds, and even in people's gardens. Every gardener I know, including some who think that they're organic, has a can of Roundup in the shed. And if you challenge them on it, they'll say, it's safe, it's biodegradable. And you say, well, actually, those claims have been overturned in 2 courts across the world, one in America and one in France. And, of course, they don't hear about that because all they hear is the marketing claims. Roundup is found everywhere. Glyphosate, its active ingredient, has been found in people's blood and urine, in the rain, in the air, and in groundwater. And permitted residue levels in food and feed crops have been systematically raised to accommodate the increased use. We were concerned because at that particular time, Roundup Ready GM maize was in the approvals pipeline for cultivation in the EU. Also because the EU Commission inexplicably seems in love with GM crops, or perhaps with the companies that promote them, most of which are herbicide tolerant. And also, of course, because Roundup is used everywhere. The EU Commission was presented with the study. We're not sure who presented them with it, but it was presented to Commissioner Dalli. We expected the Commission to do something. I'm not naive enough to think that there was going to be a total ban straight away, but we at least expected a proper investigation. especially as other studies from the independent non-industry scientific literature confirmed the findings of these malformations. This was not the first experiment to find malformations from Roundup exposure. Okay, so were we naive? Apparently so, because the Commission did none of these things. It didn't ban or restrict or even do a proper investigation. What it did do was it asked the German government to comment on Professor Carrasco's study. And the German government came back with a response saying that there was no evidence of teratogenicity, that is, ability to cause birth defects, citing largely industry studies on glyphosate as the evidence of safety. Apparently, yes, we were naive. I had a chat with a long-time campaigner on pesticides about our disappointment with the Commission response, and he laughed like a drain. And after he stopped laughing, he said, "It would not matter if you had 400 such studies. The Commission and the regulators would ignore them all." And I said, "What?" And he said, yes, there's the example of bisphenol A, where there were hundreds of studies showing harm, some of these at low realistic doses that you and I are exposed to, and in some cases that we actually carry in our body tissues. Findings of harm are there in the independent literature, but these studies have been systematically dismissed by EFSA and other regulatory agencies and bodies within Europe. BPA, bisphenol A, is not the only one. He reeled off a list of substances that this had been the procedure with. The situation is that regulators mostly rely on industry's own studies to assess the safety of a substance or a product like a GMO. And these studies are, of course, commissioned, sponsored by the very same companies that stand to profit from a regulatory approval. I think that probably most people in this room will know this, but when you mention it to the public, they're completely shocked. They somehow think that regulators commission independent tests or something on products, and that there's some kind of independent science that goes into the debate. Actually, there's very little. Most of the industry studies are not published, and they can't be evaluated by independent scientists and the public. In some cases, studies are published in peer-reviewed journals, but these are sometimes industry-sponsored studies. In some cases, there is disclosure, and the industry affiliation is disclosed. Often with the older studies, it's not disclosed, and you have to do your own research to find out that actually this is an industry study. Now, does it matter that regulatory assessments are based mostly on industry studies? We say it does because there's been a lot of scientific reviews of studies on the same substance, a data set from independent science and a data set from industry. And consistently we come up with the same result, that industry studies are more likely to find a verdict of safety, whereas financially independent studies are more likely to show risk. And some of those studies will also show safety, but there tends to be a mixture, risk and safety, in the independent studies. And this has been found true of studies on tobacco, mobile phones, GMOs, medical products, pharmaceuticals, and chemicals. And that list only seems limited because that's the amount of products that those kinds of studies have been done on. I'm pretty sure that the result would be similar, whatever product we chose. So why do regulators prefer industry studies? Now, industry and regulators have both told us that industry studies are reliable. They use that word because they are done according to good laboratory practice, GLP for short. However, we did some investigation into what GLP was, and it is a laboratory management system invented by regulators in the 1970s and 80s to combat industry fraud in testing. And funnily enough, one of these high-profile cases of fraud was indeed involving Monsanto's tests on glyphosate that it commissioned from a laboratory. GLP is a set of rules governing how the scientists carry out and record and archive the experiments. What GLP is not is it's not a hallmark of good science. GLP says nothing about the quality of the experimental design, the suitability of the endpoints chosen, the sensitivity of the tests used. However, GLP increasingly is used as a shield for industry to defend its products against inconvenient findings from independent science. We're not attacking GLP. We say it's very valuable for helping to combat industry fraud, and it must continue to be used for industry tests. But GLP must not be used as a shield to protect industry from the inconvenient findings of independent studies. And by the way, we had a conversation, some colleagues of mine had a conversation with EFSA, where my colleagues challenged them to admit what was the most common reason why you reject independent studies in risk assessment. And they came up with the answer eventually, yes, it's GLP and it's OECD protocols, which is a set of protocols that all industry tests have to go by. And of course, independent science doesn't do OECD, and it also doesn't normally do GLP either. So as well as GLP, regulators also prefer these OECD protocols. In contrast, independent studies vary from test to test. Their design is very different because independent science is always looking to find new discoveries. It doesn't want to be tied to a particular set of protocols. Of course, it is very useful to have some kind of harmonized testing system in place so that industry can do the same set of tests all over the world and they'll be accepted anywhere in the world. That is very necessary. But what we're saying is that independent science should also fully be taken into account in the risk assessment. At the moment, it isn't. So these OECD protocols, are they wonderful? Well, we talked to some scientists and they told us that they were not wonderful at all. They criticised them particularly for having out-of-date and insensitive designs. And some scientists at the Ramazzini Institute have done 40 years' worth of research to show such findings as a huge proportion of cancers triggered by a chemical exposure are missed in these OECD protocols, which actually demand that the animals are killed 2/3 of the way through their lives, and therefore all the cancers that show up in the old age of the animal are missed, so they don't show up. OECD tests often miss effects from exposure in vulnerable periods, including fetal development, old age. And they also are not very good at picking up low-dose effects. Now, the EU Parliament and Council realised that there was a problem with the dominance of OECD GLP industry tests in risk assessment. So they made a brilliant new pesticide law. It's not perfect, but it's a very good law. And it insists that not only industry studies, but also peer-reviewed independent studies be fully taken into account in the risk assessments. However, in January 2011, EFSA issued a guidance which is a fatal guidance. It completely undermines this wonderful new pesticide law. It allows independent studies to continue to be disregarded on the grounds that they are non-OECD and non-GLP. And this was enabled by something that we've come to call the Klimisch loophole. Who is Klimisch? He was an employee of BASF Chemical Company. In 1997, a very long time ago, he published a paper in an industry-funded scientific journal that was itself investigated by Congress in the US because of its industry funding and connections. And in this paper, Klimisch defines how to assess the reliability of a scientific study. And maybe all you scientists, I'm not a scientist, but could I ask all the scientists in the audience to just think in their minds, what's your idea of a criterion to assess the reliability of a scientific study? I'll tell you what the EU has decided. Klimisch's one and only criterion for assessing the reliability of the study is whether it is GLP. According to Klimisch, non-GLP studies, however rigorous, can only qualify as reliable with restriction or as unreliable. Needless to say, only industry studies are GLP. Therefore, according to Klimisch doctrine, only industry studies are reliable for risk assessment purposes. Unfortunately, the Klimisch loophole has now been introduced into EU guidance on risk assessment by EFSA, ECHA, the Chemicals Agency, this committee that I can't pronounce, which is about emerging and new health risks, SCENIR, and DG Sanco, and possibly others as well. This Klimisch loophole enables independent studies to continue to be ignored in risk assessment. Indeed, it demands that they are ignored. So the result is that independent science is still ignored, science is robbed of its signalling role, industry is the victor, and public health and the environment are the victims. As for those industry studies on glyphosate that were supposed to show it was safe, we actually asked the German government to release its dossier on glyphosate, which they did eventually. And what this showed was that even tests done by industry, according to these very insensitive OECD protocols, still found malformations from glyphosate exposure, and not only at the very high doses, they were also found at the lower doses. And Germany, as the rapporteur state for glyphosate, made a series of amazing excuses for these malformations, mostly dismissing them via something called historical control data, which is what you use when you don't like what the controls in your own experiment are showing. You say, okay, well, we're finding a toxic effect in this one experiment, so we'll ignore the data from the controls in this experiment. Instead, we'll go to all the historical control data. And what happens then is you get so many variables creeping into your data set that the effect completely disappears. So essentially, they managed to disappear all these malformations from glyphosate. We did come up with some solutions in combination with other NGOs and scientists, and we're putting these to the EU authorities. First of all, we suggest that there is an end to industry testing its own products. Instead, we suggest that industry pay money for tests into a central fund which is administered by government, and government then commissions independent labs to do the testing. So there's a kind of a cordon sanitaire, a wall between industry and the labs that are doing the testing. Solution number 2, include independent science. Regulators must include all competent studies in the risk assessment and de-weight studies with financial conflict of interest. And regulators must publish rigorous scientific reasons for rejecting any study from the risk assessment. At the moment, they don't. They just will issue some kind of bizarre statement saying, oh, well, these tests were not done according to internationally validated protocols, by which they mean OECD protocols. Alternatively, they use the code word reliable. These studies are not reliable, and by that they mean they're non-GLP. Solution number 3, foster independent science. This is something that Angelica knows more about than me, but it has been put to me by a GM researcher, an independent GM researcher, that 90%, possibly 95% of all research that's done on GMOs currently is actually industry controlled and industry sponsored. I don't know, I have no evidence for that, but it seems plausible. Solution number 4, update the required tests, redesign the standard tests that pesticides and chemicals have to go through to reflect up-to-date scientific knowledge. And solution number 5, this is where all you scientists come in. Please tell the EU authorities what you think reliable science consists of, how to evaluate what is a reliable study to go into a risk assessment. Because at the moment, the definition that they're operating by, I don't think many of you would agree with. And that is it. Thank you for listening.